Remembering Vivian by Sue Marie Casagrande. When I first met Vivian, she was staying in a shared room in one of our local skilled nursing facilities, having converted to custodial status, which means the skilled nursing facility was planning on keeping her there to live full time. Many steps needed to be taken for Vivian to return home, including signing up with a private caregiving agency for daily caregivers to help with personal and household care. To cover the cost of private caregivers while waiting for her long-term care policy's elimination period to transpire, Vivian also took out a reverse mortgage on her home. Once Vivian met her 90-day elimination period, she had a monthly budget of up to $7,500 with which to cover the cost of private caregiving. At the time, this equated to several hours per month, not anywhere close to 24/7, but enough that she and her spouse received help with housekeeping, meal preparation, grocery shopping, and pet care, in addition to help with activities of daily living. Vivian's spouse passed away 18 months after she returned home from the skilled nursing facility. She did okay on her own, but the home was too big, and it soon became clear she would need more assistance in caring for herself than her long-term care policy would cover. Vivian also began working with my friend Deb Hurd, who assisted her in downsizing and eventually putting her home on the market with a plan to move into assisted living at Brookdale Montclair Park in Poulsbo. As often happens, Vivian moved a couple of times until she found the right apartment for her, which was on the top level of Brookdale Montclair, overlooking the Olympic Mountains. Vivian encountered the same challenges all of us encountered when COVID came around. She also experienced a lot of increased anxiety during COVID, especially after her primary care physician abruptly left his practice and we had to find a new primary care physician for her. Vivian did quite well at Brookdale. It wasn't always easy for Vivian to have to rely so much on others for her care. Sometimes she became frustrated with certain aspects of her care, but wasn't usually sure how to identify and communicate her needs to staff. She would complain to me, I would listen, paraphrase what I thought was happening for clarity, and determine how best to get her needs and wants met based on her current wishes and available resources. I became and remained Vivian's advocate and point person for coordinating all her care throughout her multiple moves, the loss of her husband and cat, the COVID pandemic, and the challenges of growing old in a fragmented world. We talked on the phone daily, especially throughout the worst of the pandemic when Vivian started having panic attacks. I was able to talk her down over the phone, not being able to visit her in person. Vivian, Deb, and I worked as a team to do as much as we could to make things better for Miss V, as some caregivers preferred to call her. I brought Vivian to her medical appointments and helped coordinate her care so that all her providers knew what was happening with her, not just with her heart or her lungs, her eyes or her teeth, but with Vivian as an individual with unique needs and concerns that affected all of her health and well-being, just like all of us. As I continue to support Vivian medically and work with her emotionally, I became aware of her fear of death. Eventually, she was ready. Both Deb and I started working with Vivian on her personal values and feelings about end of life. While I prepared her emotionally and mentally, Deb worked with Vivian to put together all her end-of-life wishes regarding her choices of funeral homes, how she would want her end-of-life celebration to go, who would conduct the service at her church, what would happen to her remains. These plans were well established many months before her passing, and I believe it gave her comfort to have an idea of how things would go once she was gone. In the last 18 months of her life or so, Vivian began contracting pneumonia as she'd had compromised lungs for most of her life due to tuberculosis exposure. Her physician was excellent at prescribing the right medication, and if we caught it early enough, she could avoid a hospitalization for IV antibiotics. Her lungs continued to give her trouble, and her fatigue increased. Her strength decreased, and her emotions grew weary. We talked about palliative care or hospice care as two options for receiving care without having to go back to the hospital anymore. If she chose palliative care, I explained she would still be able to go to the hospital for certain things, but with hospice, the focus is on comfort, and she would need to be discharged from hospice care in order to go to the hospital for curative care. After the treatment, she would then be free to enroll in hospice again. During our last appointment with her physician, he shared that when his patients decide to go on to hospice, they are ultimately saying that they no longer want to go to the hospital. We had already figured out how to get her lungs x-rayed at home when we suspected pneumonia was developing. We were prepared to order home IV antibiotics if necessary. We were also prepared to support her in going into palliative care or hospice. Her choice, no questions asked, because this was her life and it needed to go her way. One evening, Vivian and I were talking about her health, her life, her happiness, and whether she wanted to continue to go to the hospital for curative treatments, go into palliative care, and potentially receive IV antibiotics at home if needed, or let nature take its course. She said she wanted to let nature take its course, and so we enrolled her in hospice with Virginia Mason Franciscan Health's hospice program the next day. There were a few bumps during the initiation of hospice. The hospice nurse didn't want Vivian to take any prophylactic antibiotics to help keep her lungs a little clearer so that she could breathe more easily. She wanted to prescribe a very strong antipsychotic to help Vivian sleep, not understanding how sensitive she was to medications and all chemicals. She also wanted to increase Vivian's antidepressant dose after her physician had been working for at least a year to slowly raise the dose in tiny increments so she could gradually reach the lowest dose made by the manufacturer. At that point, I advocated directly with Vivian's primary care physician, PCP, and he wrote a prescription for prophylactic antibiotics for Vivian, as well as orders to maintain her low dose of an antidepressant. As her PCP, he could override hospice orders as he had the final say in her treatment. This wasn't necessary, though, because the hospice medical director agreed with Vivian's PCP and let the nurse know prophylactic antibiotics were not curative and thus acceptable for hospice patients in our area. Vivian did not want to die alone. She did not want to die in pain. She wanted either Deb or me with her and by her side in the end. After 7 years of working with Vivian, we both made solemn promises to do just that, and that's exactly what we did. I tried to soothe Vivian's discomfort by purchasing small, washable pillows that we could put in various places to help alleviate pressure. I brought a lavender sachet from the Sequim Lavender Festival for her to smell, since she loved flowers and specifically the Lavender Festival. I set up her TV on YouTube to show beautiful nature images of flowers and landscapes with soothing music in the background. Staff came to see her and to say goodbye and let her know how much she meant to them. Many of them told her that they loved her. On the very early morning of October 21st, 2023, Not long past midnight, Vivian exhaled her last breath and died peacefully on her bed at home with a friend by her side, exactly as she wanted to go. It was truly an honor and privilege to support Vivian from her time in the skilled nursing facility to her last moments on earth. She was a deeply loving, compassionate, caring person who loved all the world. We grew to love one another, and I think of her often. I also feel proud of the work I did with her because I know it made a difference and enabled her to live her last years the way she wanted. She was one of a kind, and I will never forget her. Sue Marie Casagrande is the owner of Care Plans Plus. She is an advanced care life professional. She is also holds an LICSW and a C-ASWCM. You can reach her at 360-881-7900 or www.careplansplus.com.